God of our fathers, whose almighty hand leads forth in beauty all the starry band of shining worlds in splendor through the skies. Our grateful songs before thy throne arise. Thy love divine hath led us in the past. In this free land by thee our lot is cast. Be thou our ruler, guardian, guide, and stay. Thy word our law, thy path our chosen way. From war's alarms, from deadly pestilence, be thy strong arm our ever sure defense. Thy true religion in our hearts increase. Thy bounteous goodness nourish us in peace. Refresh thy people on their toilsome way. Lead us from night to never-ending day. Fill all our lives with love and grace divine, and glory, laud, and praise be ever thine.
Well, we're down in number because we've got several away on holiday and a number away because of sickness. However, we're going to take up the study of Ezekiel again this morning. You will remember, I hope, that last week we dealt with a little bit of the background to Ezekiel, and we talked about the distinctiveness of this book. We showed how it's different in many ways from other books of prophecy, and how Ezekiel himself was rather unique among the prophets because of his style and because of his, well, almost how Ezekiel himself is different because of his almost eccentricity. But I want us to pick up today by emphasizing the keynote of this book, and that I would suggest is the keynote of glory and holiness. As a matter of fact, in the Old Testament there are 7 different words, Hebrew words for glory. This one, the word kabod, is used 155 times, and it's the word that is constantly used by Ezekiel. The phrase, the glory of the Lord, occurs 12 times in the first 11 chapters. And then there's a long gap in the book, and you don't encounter it again until Ezekiel 43 and verse 2. So he's concerned about the glory of God, and it's particularly the glory that proclaims God's holiness. And I think there's a point to be made here in passing, and it's simply this. But very often we talk about righteousness, and we're concerned about God's righteousness. We said that God wants us to be righteous, and that's what salvation is all about. But it seems to me that before we should think about the righteousness of God, there's the question of the holiness of God that ought to be considered. God is righteous because He is holy. And the most important characteristic of the nature of God is not even love. It's not righteousness. It is holiness. This is God's essential nature. And because God is holy, He is righteous. And if you think of the word righteous in this particular sense as meaning right in everything, that's what it means. God is right in everything because His nature is essentially that of holiness. And the holiness of God is demonstrated, is revealed, as far as it's possible for man to see it, in the manifestation of His glory. And that's the glory that we see in this book. Ezekiel's concerned about this glory. And indeed, it's interesting to see the glory as it removed from the temple. We'll look at this perhaps later. I won't get into that just now. I'll come on to it in a minute or two. But what I'm trying to say is, first of all, the holiness of God is seen in contrast with the impurity, with the defilement of His people and the temple. God says, for example, "Ye have defiled my sanctuary, therefore I will make waste." In other words, I'm going to let you be destroyed because you have defiled my sanctuary. Now remember that originally God's people were meant to be a holy people. Do you remember that when the covenant was made at Mount Sinai, God says, "You shall be a holy nation unto me." And that's what Israel was intended to be, a reflection of God's own character and showing God's own holiness. Now the temple was defiled, God says, and in chapter 8, if you want to turn to that, you'll see 4 ways in which the people were defiling the temple. If you read that, you'll discover that first of all, the prophet is translated secretly in the Spirit to Jerusalem. Now this is before the final onslaught of Nebuchadnezzar on the city of Jerusalem. He's taken to the temple, and through a hole, and by the way, remember that he is in Chaldea. He is in Babylonia at this time, so this is not a literal journey that he makes. It's in vision form, as I think is made plain by chapter 10 later on. It's a vision that he has. But God takes him, and in the vision, he sees the temple. He sees a hole in the temple, which you have to enlarge to get inside. And once inside, he sees a door. And behind the door, he sees 4 kinds of idolatry that are being actually practiced in the courts of the temple of God. First of all, he sees 70 of the elders of Israel worshipping, as verse 10 says, all kinds of abominable things, living creatures. And this was a reflection of Egyptian idolatry. Remember that in Egypt, the worship was creature worship. All kinds of animals were regarded as sacred. And because in the time of Jeremiah, a little while before Ezekiel here, there had been the rise of what might be called a pro-Egyptian party in Judea rather. They had introduced Egyptian religion, and that involved creature worship. And that's what the prophet sees the elders, the leaders of the people doing. He sees again, in verse 14, women weeping for Tammuz. That's maybe the only time it occurs in the Old Testament, the word Tammuz. But it really dates back to the ancient Babylonian and Assyrian religions. There is in ancient Babylonian legend, a legend called the descent of Nanar or Ishtar into the netherworld. And Tammuz was the son of Ishtar, the goddess Ishtar. Tammuz corresponds actually with Adonis of the Greek and the Greek and Roman religion, and Adonis was the son of Venus. Now, in the ancient legends, Adonis or Tammuz died, but then there's something that seems to resemble a resurrection, and so the women wept for his death. And then at the so-called resurrection, there was feasting, and immoral feasting at that. Scenes of the greatest licentiousness took place with that kind of religion, because it was a fertility religion. The death and the resurrection of Tammuz was supposed to indicate fruitfulness. The death of the land at winter and the rising again of fruitfulness when the spring came. And these were the ceremonies that they took part in. The worshippers imagined that they could help the fertility of the land by copying the behavior of their gods in sexual activity. And that's exactly what was going on with the women weeping for Tammuz. And then after this would come this great feast celebrating the resurrection of Tammuz with the immorality, the licentiousness that went along with such a feast. Impurity again. He sees what's called the image of jealousy. Now this again, possibly images of the god Ashtoreth or Ashtoreth that Josiah had removed from the temple, but which now the people had restored. And then he says again, he sees the men worshipping the sun with their faces to the east, and in other words, with their backs to the temple of the Lord. Now here again is the worship of the sun in the form of a disc. Went way back to Egyptian times. It was copied also by the worship of the sun god by the Babylonians and the Assyrians. So they've got hold of all these different kinds of idolatry from the nations round about them. And because of this, the temple is defiled. And the Shekinah, the glory of the Lord, leaves the temple. God will no longer stay in that place, which is an affront to His own holiness. And the glory leaves, but gradually. If you turn to chapter 10, you notice verse 3. It first of all moves from the inner sanctuary. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was, representative of the real presence of God there. The glory leaves the inner sanctuary and fills the inner court, first of all, settling near the threshold of the door. And then in verse 18, it departs from the threshold, from the door, and rests over the cherubim. Now Solomon had made 2 huge cherubim at the entrance to the temple. And then, in chapter 11 and verse 23, as the cherubim mount up from the earth, the glory mounts up with them, above their wings, and moves out to the temple and rests on the temple. That's in chapter 11 and verse 23, as I said. When does it come back? When will God's glory come back? Well, God's glory does not come back to the city and the temple until, chapter 43 and verse 2. Until the temple has been restored. Until holiness has been restored. And the book itself closes with this promise, the very last verse in the book of Ezekiel. Yahweh Shammah, Jehovah Shammah, the Lord is there. In other words, this is restoration. Now, it's because Ezekiel's concerned with this glory of God that symbolizes God's holiness that he has this vision of God in chapter 1. Of course, this vision of God's glory is seen several times in the book, actually, about half a dozen times. But nevertheless, notice the details in chapter 1. In verse 3, Ezekiel is in a trance. He says the hand of the Lord was heavy upon him. And that literally means that he was in some kind of trance, some kind of spiritual condition that enabled him to have this vision. And he sees out of the north, verse 4 says, the approach of a storm cloud. And the thing that strikes him about this storm cloud, you know how normally you look at the sky and the sky is black and lowering, as the scriptures say, heavy and dark. This storm cloud is different. It's fiery. He sees brightness. And as this great cloud, which gives him the sense of an impending storm, comes nearer, it resolves itself into shapes. Into the shapes of 4 different creatures. And those creatures are arranged in a square. Now, the general appearance of the creatures is human. The general appearance. Except, of course, that unlike human beings, they had 4 faces. And their legs were not like human legs. And they had wings. And there are fiery flashes in rapid succession. He speaks in verse 4 of the fire enfolding itself, literally catching itself. You sometimes see lights that are flashing so quickly, each one a separate flash, but coming with such rapidity that it seems to be one constant blaze, one constant flash. And that's what he sees here. That there is this very rapid flashing that is so fast that it seems to be one continuous blaze. Now, I mentioned the cherubim. Well, earlier on. Well, this, I believe, is what he's talking about here. He's talking about the cherubim. The cherubim, the word cherubim is plural. Cherub is singular. Cherubim, plural. He doesn't say what these living creatures are, actually. But when he sees them again, he describes them as cherubim. And you know, if you go through the Old Testament, you discover that cherubim, not seraphim, it's strange that, isn't it? Cherubim and seraphim we talk about, but seraphim only occurs once in the Bible. Cherubim are creatures which are always extremely closely linked to the person of God, to the presence of God. Whether they're seen at the Garden of Eden as guardians of the garden after man has sinned, or whether they're seen in the Holy of Holies with their wings outstretched above the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, or whether you see them embroidered on the beautiful veil or curtain inside the tabernacle, or whether you see them carved on the walls of the temple by Solomon, or the huge cherubim some 15 feet high carved by Solomon for the entrance to the temple, they always indicate the presence of God. Always related to God's holiness. Now, there's something different about the cherubim here, and cherubim, as you find them pretty often in ancient literature. I think we should understand this. Scholars tell us that various peoples in the past have been said to be responsible for the concept of these heavenly spiritual creatures called the cherubim. The Chaldeans, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Syrians have all been credited with being the very first to mention cherubim. But you know, it's been a pretty common symbol all through the East, and there's been one big difference between the Jewish or the Hebrew idea of the cherubim and that of these other nations. You take the Greeks, for example. Now, the Greeks carved cherubim and depicted cherubim, but you discover that in Grecian art, the cherubim were always painted or presented with a very beautiful form. Lovely creatures. But in Hebrew, no. You can see from these creatures, they're not beautiful. The thing that strikes you is not their beauty. It's rather their grotesqueness. Well, I mean, creatures with four faces. Ox, man, eagle, lion. I mean, this is hardly something that would give you a feeling of affinity with them, or you would hardly think them as being kindred beings with yourself. So they're grotesque and strange in Hebrew literature. Do you know why? Because when people saw the beauty of these creatures in Greek art, they became absorbed with the beauty, with the imagery, with the artistry. But when the Bible describes these creatures, they're described in a way that helps us to realize their purpose is to bring us to worship. That's the prime purpose. And help us to realize, too, that really they're only symbolic creatures. They're symbolic of the holiness and the presence of God, and they ought to lead to the feeling of worship and adoration. Adoration of God, not themselves. When you look at that description again, each had 4 wings. Creature with 4 wings. One pair stretched out to touch the others on either side, in the square, and the others were enfolded over their bodies. Their legs were straight, which means without knee joints, which means they were not meant for walking, which means these creatures were never meant to walk. They didn't transport themselves by means of legs. And their feet Well, their feet are described as like calves' feet. Now that means they're not projecting like human feet, pointing in any one direction, but they're round and solid. And the whole group seems to blaze with light. These flashes of lightning that I mentioned, following so rapidly that there's a constant blaze of light. And the whole group moves with tremendous speed. That's another thing. And it doesn't turn as it moves. It doesn't revolve. Well, of course, since these four creatures are arranged in a square, each creature having four faces, whichever way they turn, they presented the same front. This is important. And their round feet made it possible for them to change direction, almost like a ball foot. So here you've got four creatures moving in perfect coordination and in perfect harmony. I wonder, how could well, there are four wheels. Let me mention this first. Besides the four living creatures, there are four wheels, also arranged so that they could change direction without changing front. Wheels within wheels. That's where the face comes from, Ezekiel. Wheels within wheels. Did you ever, as a child, have one of those gyroscopic tops? That's right. You know the kind of top I mean, don't you? With the sort of little rim around and the top within. But that's really the kind of thing we're talking about. The wheels within the wheels. And although they don't seem to be connected with these four living creatures, the wheels move in perfect harmony with them. When the creatures go forward, they go forward. When the creatures ascend or descend, the wheels ascend and descend. And above it all, there is a solid platform of crystal, so this almost seems to be like a mobile throne. A solid platform of crystal with a throne on it, and a figure seated on the throne. A figure which looks human. He has the likeness as the appearance of a man, the prophet says, clothed in overwhelming brightness. So can you imagine this as a kind of mobile throne? The creatures, the cherubim, the wheels within the wheels, the solid crystalline platform, the throne, and a seated figure. What is it? Well, obviously when the prophet tries to describe the glory of God and the presence of God and the character of God, he's undertaking a job that's virtually impossible. He's trying as far as it's possible with human language to depict the holiness, the glory, the majesty, and the power of God. He can't do it, of course, obviously, because human language is too limited to describe what he sees, and that's why he constantly has to use those words, like unto and likeness. Now, of course, men have, on various occasions in the Bible, had visions of the glory of God. But how do you describe God? The one who is himself the source, the origin of all power, the one who is himself the sum of all wisdom and knowledge, the one who is himself all that is right. How can you describe a creature like that in human terms? The only thing that Ezekiel can do is to use human language. And again, how can the majesty of the inexpressible God be revealed in a way that men are going to recognize it? Moses had the problem. Moses asked God, I want to see you. Let me see your face. And God says, you cannot see my face. No man can see my face and live. But Moses was granted, you remember, the privilege of seeing a manifestation, a revelation of God. He went into the cleft of the rock there in the mountain, and there came an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake, it says. And there came a wind, but God was not in the wind. There came a fire, but God was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. In other words, the murmur of a voice. And that was God revealing his presence. God says to Moses, thou canst not see my face, but thou shalt see my hinder parts. You'll see my back. Now again, this is not to say that God has a physical body like ourselves. This is what the Mormons think. Because anybody who has a physical body, or any kind of body as we have, is limited as to time and space. Any kind of body is limited in that way. But God is limitless. He's unlimited. He's unlimited because he's omnipresent. He has the ability of being everywhere present at the same time. He knows everything. He's unlimited as to knowledge. He's all-powerful. He's omnipotent. He's unlimited as to what he can do. Now, obviously, these are facets of the character of God that can't be displayed for human eyes to see. So what we have here is God revealing himself in a way that will give to men the awesome sense of his presence. For example, in the book of, I think it's Deuteronomy, we're told that Moses and 70 of the elders of Israel went up into the Mount Sinai, and they did see the God of heaven, and there was under his feet a pavement as of a sapphire stone, and the very body of heaven for brightness, and they did eat and drink in his presence, we're told. Here again was a manifestation of God. So that's really what Ezekiel's trying to describe. And if you think of the symbols that he uses, the whole effect of the vision is to give the impression of majesty and might. The fire and the lightning will speak of God's awfulness, God's terribleness. The height of the wheels, for example, in verse 18, the imposing height of the throne, the sounds that come from the throne give the same impression of a controlled power, might in harness. The arrangement of the creatures and the wheels, with their ability to move like lightning in any direction, gives the impression, as far as it's possible, of the omnipresence of God. God could be everywhere present at the same time. To transport itself without having seemed to have moved. That's the idea. God doesn't need to change direction. It's as though he never moves, but he's everywhere. The wheels full of eyes, there are eyes around the rims of the wheels, suggest the omniscience of God. That God knows everything. That the fire that he sees, as I mentioned, is the symbol of purity and holiness. The faces, the various aspects of the character of God. What's the face of man suggest? Intelligence. What about the face of the lion? Kingship and strength, yes. What about the eagle? In the Bible, the eagle is the symbol of deity. The ox is the symbol of power, the symbol of strength. Now, these are aspects of God's character. And again, in verse 28 of that same chapter, there's the rainbow around the throne. Something peculiar about this rainbow. The rainbow that we see is an arc of, well, at the very best, half a circle. But this rainbow is a complete circle. Or, it's a bow that completely encircles the mobile throne with the being on it. Something else about it too. It's a moment. Look at verse 28. Where am I? Yes. As the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud in the day of rain, so was the appearance of the brightness round about. Now, what's the rainbow the symbol of? Yeah, one word. The promise of what? Mercy, that's the word, yes. Now, obviously, you seeing this throne, you overwhelmed, awestruck by its majesty, terrified by its brightness, are made to understand that it's marked and characterized also by mercy and goodness. If you thought only of the righteousness of God and the holiness of God, you'd be scared, like the prophet Isaiah in chapter 6. Woe is me, for I am undone, for mine eyes have seen the Lord, or Jehovah, King of hosts. This would surely be our impression if we saw only the righteousness of God and the holiness of God. But God wants us to understand that there is this other aspect to his character. He is the God of all mercy. He's merciful and he's loving. Now, this is the glory that he's concerned about. And as I say, the glory departs from the city and from the temple, because the city and the temple and the people become defiled. And in fact, Ezekiel is commanded to cease his message, to cease his testimony to the people. And he stops doing that. He stops preaching. He's told to stop preaching until a message comes telling that the city has actually fallen to Nebuchadnezzar. Well, as we know, chapter 24 describes that Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to the city. And the same day that the siege begins is the day that Ezekiel's wife dies. And Ezekiel is commanded that day, after that day, to be silent until those messengers come back to the telling of the fall of the city. That's verses 25 and 26 and 27 for that matter. Now, the reason for his silence is given in chapter 33. The people like to hear his voice. The people enjoy his sermons, but they don't pay attention to them. And so God says, stop preaching until it's proved that what you say is true. And then when the messenger comes, the fugitive who's managed to get away and tells of the destruction of the city, Ezekiel is again commanded to deliver the message, because the people now have the evidence that he's a true prophet of Jehovah. Now, one point that I want to make before we conclude for some questions or discussion. Remember that when the blow fell, when Jerusalem fell, he was struggling to contain his personal grief at the death of his wife. Now the temple and the city is gone, and he realizes he'll never see them again. But the fulfillment of his prophecies have given him a standing among the people that he didn't have before. And now he has the job of rallying the exiles to survive this tragedy to Jerusalem, to the temple. He says in chapter 34, verse 11, God speaks, "Behold, I, even I, will become Israel's shepherd." And it's in passages like these where Ezekiel speaks of God caring for his people. Passages such as these that have led the scholars to regard Ezekiel as the vital link between the Old and the New Testaments. The dust hasn't really settled over Jerusalem. Before in chapter 34, he foresees the gathering together of God's people. And furthermore, he doesn't allow the grief that he's feeling, both for himself, his own loss, and the nation's loss, to hinder his work. But instead he becomes involved with the planning of the new Jerusalem, which he believes is going to be even greater than the old one. In chapter 40 you have a description of this. 14 years after the city fell, to the very day, he has another vision of the new city. And he tells the captives what he's seen. Now, the fall of the city, and I think you can understand this, the fall of the city and the destruction of the temple could very easily have meant the end of the Jewish nation. Very easily. In fact, that's exactly what Nebuchadnezzar meant it to do. Because he destroyed the city and the temple and hoped in destroying the seat of worship and the things that the people venerated, and then taking the people out and mixing them throughout the empire, he'd caused them to lose their distinctive character, their racial and their religious distinctiveness. They were thrown into a melting pot, so to speak, like many other nations of the time. In fact, he hoped to accomplish with Judah what the Assyrians had accomplished with Israel. And you know that really Israel became lost completely in Assyria, dispersed throughout the empire, so that even today you still get people asking what happened to the 10 tribes of Israel. They didn't come back as a people. And you know, it's due in very large measure to this man and to God's providence through his ministry that this didn't happen to Judah. Now, the book of Daniel, for example, and this is interesting, we'll look at this next, is set against the background of life in Babylon. And you can see in that book some of the temptations and the dangers to which they were subjected. They were under constant pressure, the pressure to become idolatrous. There were always the terrors, well, the fiery furnace, for example, always the lion's den for those who rebelled. And it was really due to the unfaltering faithfulness of Ezekiel that the people did keep faithful to God under these circumstances. You think, for example, of the temptations there in Babylon. Have you ever stopped to think? I don't know if any of you watched Magnus Magnusson's pictures of Babylon the other Thursday. I've stopped looking at them because they only irritate me. But I know what he was going to show. But the first impression on the weary exiles arriving at Babylon, why, it must have been fantastic. The most impressive and magnificent city they'd ever seen. Surrounded by double walls, each 24 feet thick and a space of 90 feet between. Magnificent streets, the hanging gardens of Babylon, the Tower of Babel, the temples to Marduk and Bel and Nebo, the palaces, the bridges spanning the Euphrates. Why, he put Jerusalem in the shade. They'd never seen anything like that. And can you imagine them coming from a place like Jerusalem that they used to think was really it, coming to a place like Babylon? It wouldn't be surprising if they were not only impressed and overawed by the sight, but disarmed by the magnificence. And they could soon be taken up in it, you know. They could soon fall in with Babylonian ways. And those who remained faithful under those circumstances weren't blind either. They saw the difference, and they became discouraged. How shall we sing the Lord's songs in a strange land? And it's due to Ezekiel's ministry that really they did keep faithful, because he offers them not only restoration, but he offers them forgiveness. He points out that although their sins have been great, God is able to forgive. And he repeats time and time again the message that true repentance will bring forgiveness from God. Now, this reveals something important about this message, and I want to close with this. He talks much more about a restoration of the Jews to Palestine, but he talks about a restoration of holiness and sanctification. And that is seen in the temple that he describes. Now, I wish we had the time to deal with it. I can't go through that today. But if you look at the temple that Ezekiel describes, you'll find that the first thing that distinguishes it from the old temple was its separation. In the old temple, the sacred and the secular mixed together. In the new temple, the people were kept away from the sanctified parts entirely. There's a place for the people and a place for the priests. The new temple was bigger in so many ways. I'm putting it in a word. When they came to restore the temple, although the temple was never built on the scale that Ezekiel envisaged it, nevertheless, to a very large extent, they followed the pattern. And we saw the pattern.
Dear Lord and Father of mankind, forgive our foolish ways. Reclothe us in our rightful mind, in purer lives thy service find, in deeper reverence pray. gracious calling of the Lord, let us, like them, without a word, rise up and follow thee. O Sabbath rest by Galilee, O calm of hills above, where Jesus knelt to share with thee the silence of eternity, interpreted by love. Drop thy still dews of quietness, till all our striving cease. Take from our souls the strain and stress, and let our ordered lives confess the beauty of thy peace. Christ, we do all adore thee, and we do praise thee forever. Christ, we do all adore thee, and we do praise thee forever. For on the holy cross hast thou the world from sin redeemed. Christ, we do all adore thee, and we do praise thee forever. Christ, we do all